For those of you who are not familiar with Primary Source and with our Global Read, we are a nonprofit located just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, and we provide graduate courses, professional development workshops, and study tours for approximately 2,500 educators worldwide each year. Our focus is on global education, world histories, and world cultures. And through our Global Read, we enjoy introducing new global literature to audiences, both students and teachers, and connecting you with those authors. This is our 5th Global Read, and so we've had over about 1,000 readers participate with us through the 5 books that we've read. We have, through our Global Read, we've explored Burma, Asian American immigration to the United States, the Vietnam War, and the Operation Pedro Pan from Cuba, and now we are talking about modern Delhi. So we've traveled all over through these 5 Global Reads, and we hope that you have enjoyed reading The Case of the Missing Servant. I do want to introduce our author, Tarquin Hall. I will be moderating the Q&A, so if you have any questions, put them in the chat box or raise your hand. Tarquin's going to talk for about 5 or 10 minutes about his background and bio inspiration behind the Vish Puri series. He's a British author and journalist and former South Asian Bureau Chief of Associated Press TV. He has 4 novels in the Vish Puri series. I'm hoping there's more, and 3 other nonfiction books. And as I mentioned earlier, he's coming to us live from Delhi, where it's about 1:38 a.m., so we really appreciate his generosity of his time. So Tarquin, if you want to take over and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, I'd love to. Thank you very much for having me. My favorite subject, myself. No, I'm only kidding. I'm British, as you said, but I have a American mum from Massachusetts. I see there's loads of people from Massachusetts joining the group. She grew up for the early part of her childhood on the Cape and then in Wellesley, which I have very fond memories of. Anyhow, I grew up in London mostly. And when I was 18, I decided to start traveling. I really wanted to get around the world. And I lived in a lot of different places. I actually went first to the United States and then to Pakistan. I lived in Peshawar, which has been in the news for all the wrong reasons a lot recently. And I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan. And eventually I came to India, as you said. That was in the mid-90s for the AP. And sort of fell in love with the place. And I've either been living here or coming and going from here ever since. It was probably, about 6 years ago now that I was here. I was living in London, but I was back here with my wife, who's also a journalist, and I was sitting one day with one of her cousins. I should say my wife is from an Indian family, although she grew up in the States. And this cousin of hers was in her mid-20s at that point and not married, which was scandalous. And it was a big family, well, not crisis, but anyhow, everybody was desperately trying to get her married. And she started telling me about how she'd been investigated by private detectives. And my journalist ears pricked up, and I thought, here's a good story. And so I went out and found some real-life detectives in Delhi who were sort of vaguely similar to Vish Puri, my detective. And I wrote a story about them. I just thought they were just the most fantastic characters, and they were involved with the most extraordinary, diverse assortment of cases in modern Delhi. Everything from investigating prospective brides and grooms to kidnappings to not just of humans, but of reincarnated relatives, God knows what else. And anyhow, I wrote a story about these guys for the Sunday Times newspaper in the UK. And I afterwards sort of just got thinking and thought, you know, this is just a fantastic way to talk about modern India. I'd never really thought about writing fiction before. I hadn't written any fiction up till then. And so I sat down and started basically outlining one day, you know, how it was going to be. And I found within a couple of hours I sort of outlined the whole thing and started writing. And I've done four books since. So they're all, I mean, for those who've read the first one, I think you've been reading The Case of the Missing Servant, which is the first one. I've written 3 more since. So they're all set in Delhi and modern India. And the detective Vishpuri is middle-aged, extremely pompous, very typically Punjabi, a real family man. But this being India, one of the first things I realized when I was trying to come up with the whole concept was that this is the most labor-intensive place I've ever been. I mean, if you go to a parking lot here and try to get an automatic ticket out of the machine, there's somebody there to press the button for you. So I realized immediately that he had to have a big team working for him, because everyone has a big team working for them in India. So I came up with his whole undercover team, and that was partly based on my research as well with real detectives. They do a huge amount of undercover work, detectives, private detectives, certainly in India, because it's very, very hard here to get a straight answer to any question, especially if you come from one community and you're dealing with a community that's alien to yours. They're unlikely to tell you what you need to know, whereas if they trust you, they'll probably tell you absolutely everything. So that was the basic premise of the books. How am I doing? I can't hear anything back, which is concerning. I'm just talking. For all I know, you're not there anymore.
No, we're all still here.
Okay.
Great. So you had sent me some photos of Delhi. Do you want to tell us a little bit? I can flip through those photographs as you talk about them.
Sure. I can see one on my screen at the moment, which, oh no, my screen's just gone completely blank. Oh no, there we are. The one up at the moment, which is a large tower, brick tower, with some ruins in front of it. I don't know if everybody can see that one. That's called the Qutb Minar. That's actually very close to where I live. I think it's the largest brick tower in Asia. It was built, gosh, I'm on the spot here. I want to hazard a guess and say 13th century, I think, 1200s. Anyhow, it's essentially a minaret from the top of which you would do the call to prayer, and behind it is a very old, beautiful mosque. It's one of the ancient, part of one of the 7 or 8 cities of Delhi, depending on how many you count. And this picture is taken from Old Delhi. As you can see, those bicycle rickshaws with an auto rickshaw just behind it, with the yellow frame around the windscreen. And that's the very heart of what's now called Old Delhi. That was, I mean, Old Delhi hands would still refer to it as Shah Jahanabad, because it was built by the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan. And that is the main mosque in Old Delhi, the Jama Masjid. which I think can hold about 5,000 worshippers on a Friday prayers. Again, that's Old Delhi with gas canisters being delivered. I should say I don't live I don't live right in the middle of that. I live in South Delhi with my family. I have 2 children, my wife and 2 children. We've lived here for a number of years. South Delhi is made up of gated communities, colonies, they're referred to here, of quite large houses with walls and gates around them, villas if you like, and the gates are closed at night. There's not much through traffic, and most of those colonies are in areas that were once villages on the edge of the old city of Delhi, what's now referred to as the old city of Delhi. And so I don't quite live in the tightly packed streets that you're seeing here, but it's not too far, and I love going and exploring that part of the city. There's some good Indian wiring for you. A policeman hard at work. Again, that's old Delhi. Nobody really follows that sign, I've got to say. No honking. It's not something that anyone takes much notice of. That's a shop in another part of Delhi. And street food for sale there. That's samosas and what looks like fried bread being fried in oil. Ah, and an elephant. I took that the other day. That's not far from here. We were on the lookout. We were searching for elephants. My wife was doing the story. There aren't many elephants left in Delhi. There's I think only 7 left. But they're still used just as ceremonies and weddings and temple, celebrations at temples.
Wow, that's really amazing. So let's open it up to Q&A. So if anyone has questions, you can raise your hand and ask via audio, or you can type them in the chat box. We do have a first question from Kara. She asks, or she says, the novel has both strong and subjugated female characters. Face Cream and Puri's mother, Mummy G, are so strong, while Mary is taken advantage of by her employer. To what extent do these characters represent roles of women in Delhi today?
Yeah, I mean, I think, those characterizations are very, very authentic. India is an incredibly hierarchical, divided society. So in the book, Puri's mother, for example, comes from, by Indian standards, I mean, you always have to remember in India, that the population is absolutely gigantic. So we got 1.2, nearly 3 billion people. 700 million of those people live on less than $2 a day. 70% of the economy is still agrarian, so it's still completely dominated by an agrarian economy. So it's, if you just take that into account, yes, of course, you can have a lady from a relatively well-to-do family, which Puri's family is well-to-do by the 700 million people living on $2 a day standard, even if they're not rich by Western standards. And so she's educated, she's very capable, and she has a great amount of choice and freedom, in fact. And obviously she's very feisty and takes full advantage of that. Whereas Mary, the servant girl, comes from a very, very downtrodden, impoverished part of India. I spent time there I don't want to give away too much for anybody who hasn't read the book, but I spent time from the area where she's from, and in a rural area like that, the poverty is extreme. The lack of even basic, I mean, you know, things like sanitation, education, are quite acute, and so she can be fully taken advantage of as she is in the book.
And you mentioned Mummy G, which I think from many people I've shared the book with is a favorite character and gets an even bigger role as the series goes on. What was your inspiration for that character? Was she based off of a real person, or was this, you know, is she kind of an amalgamation of different people you know? She's just a fascinating and fun character in your books.
I'm often asked this question, actually, and she wasn't based on anybody in particular. I mean, as I've said, Vishpuri is kind of a composite character based on some of the detectives I've met, but also my wife's uncles share many of the same traits. They're Punjabis, they're of that sort of age, so it was very easy to sort of draw on their characteristics to help sort of form Puri. Mummy kind of, I don't know, she sort of found her way into the book. I think somewhere she's out there trying to, and since then she's sort of found her way into all the books. She came about because I was writing the first one, and I got to, I think, about chapter 7 or 8, and I thought to myself that I needed to put a bit of danger into the plot. I really didn't have the plot worked out at all. I was just sort of seeing where it all went. And so I decided that Puri himself needed to be in some danger. So I had him go up onto the roof where he grows his green chilies, and while he's up there, suddenly bullets just start flying over the roof, and he has to drop to the ground. He's almost shot. And I had absolutely no idea who was shooting at him. But the next thing I realized was the natural thing that would happen would be that his mother finds out immediately, because the family network is so tight in an Indian family. You know, if your son's shot at, your mum finds out within minutes, wherever she is. So she sort of entered the book that way, and I just sort of, I don't know, I just sort of thought it would be fun to have this very domineering, extremely wily character who's a constant thorn in her son's side, but also, you know, terribly sort of capable and extremely caring, obviously. I think something. I mean, I think something really quite remarkable about Indian, certainly North Indian and certainly Punjabi society, is how often the men are built up to a huge degree. They're very rarely ever told within the family system that they're wrong. I mean, the boys are always built up, you know, from an early age, and the men can often, I mean, be lovely, but be terribly pompous and very full of themselves, and they're not used to anybody really sort of disagreeing with them. And the women have to sort of work around that, but are often running the whole show and are quite used to having to sort of see themselves, I think, much more, look at themselves much more than the men. And I've found often that they're much, I don't want to say they're smarter, but they're much more capable. So I think she sort of came from that impression, really.
You mentioned the assassination attempt on Puri. Is that common? I mean, you said you did research with real detectives. Is it common that their lives are threatened based on the cases that they're working on?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I talked to this one detective who very proudly told me about how different kinds of people had tried to kill him on 7 or 8 occasions. And one of them involved him sort of pulling back the curtains on the French doors in his sitting room to find a man standing there with a really sort of, you know, basic looking sort of what's called here a country-made weapon, which means a kind of homemade pistol. And it's often the case, as I think I say in the first book, that assassins or hitmen you know, are not particularly sophisticated or well trained, and they often don't have very good weapons. So they don't make very good hitmen. And I think it was the case with this guy that he'd sort of been paid, you know, I don't know, $100, or probably that would probably be quite a lot, and asked to go and shoot this guy. And once he got to the door, he had second thoughts, or he sort of, you know, couldn't go through with it. So the detective that, you know, was facing this man sort of stood there and offered him a cup of tea, and invited him in and talked him out of shooting him.
That's kind of funny. So we have another question from Anne-Marie. She asks, have you thought about how your perspective as someone who's lived in India for many years, but also someone who was mostly raised in London, how that influences your perspective on Indian life and culture through your writing?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to get asked that question a lot in India here. I mean, basically, there's no two ways about it. I'm a foreigner here, a complete outsider, really. And I write these books for a foreign audience. I mean, they have become, to my, you know, surprise, actually, and also to my delight, very, very popular here. But I didn't expect that, and I was kind of, when the first one was actually sort of presented to me as a finished book, my initial reaction was, boy, what are they going to make of this in India? So I was in London at the time. And I suddenly thought, oh boy, you know, are they going to see the humor in it? And it's been a case that people have, and as I say, you know, they're very popular, and I meet a lot of people, a lot of Indians here, you know, and I go and do events who, you know, love them. I mean, they really see the humor. I think, you know, what they tend to say to me is that they really appreciate the authenticity of the characters and the setting, etc. And they're often quite surprised that a foreigner can sort of observe it quite so accurately. I kind of don't ever really understand why some of them are quite so surprised, because I'm a journalist. I've spent years living abroad. I'm practiced at sort of seeing things, taking notes, observing detail, the way people talk, color, etc. And to me, that never really seems like a big deal. It sort of comes naturally to me, I suppose, after quite a few years of experience doing it. I think, you know, an Indian writer going to Britain and living there and writing something about Britain would do exactly the same thing and probably do a really good job. I think sometimes, obviously, India being a country that's been colonized, especially by white guys like me, for several hundred years, there is a slight issue there, and you do have to be a little bit careful because people are sensitive about the way their cultures are described. I think in the West we're much less susceptible to being offended. Our democracy is rather older and stronger. Our nation's have been around a bit longer. This is a very ancient culture that, as a nation, it hasn't existed for terribly long. So people can be quite sensitive about how their culture is described, which I can completely sympathize with and understand. But that, so sometimes you do want to tread carefully, but there's also something to be said, I think, for outsiders describing a culture. I mean, by far the best books I've ever read on the English are by an author called Idris Shah, who's from an Afghan. He's an Afghan originally, although he lived in England for many years. He wrote 3 books about the English. The first one's called Darkest England. And they're absolutely, without question, the most insightful books on the English I've ever read. So I think there's something to be said for an outsider's perspective sometimes.
And you mentioned that Mary's family, she came from the region, the Tarquin region, where there's a lot of mining and poverty. All of the books in this series tend to capture really important social issues, which the titles don't necessarily indicate that. The case of the deadly butter chicken, for example, with the India-Pakistan relationship, the case of the missing servant bringing in, there's a lot of themes of women, role of women, caste issues, the mining, and indigenous populations. Is that purposeful? Are you starting out with, I want to write a book that, you always seem to include a social issue, and I think that's really important, and it's very insightful in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I said earlier, I never set out to write fiction. The motivation was to describe modern India, and to be honest, I really don't read and never have read that much detective fiction. I mean, as a kid, I loved Sherlock Holmes. I read a lot of Agatha Christie. I'll occasionally pick up a mystery, if I'm at an airport and read it on a plane or something like that. But I don't, I didn't set out to be a crime fiction writer or write thrillers or anything like that. So when I have decided to do, when I've looked at each of these books, the main thing I've decided first is exactly what you've just described. I mean, what the theme is going to be and how I'm going to carry on describing modern India each time, so the reader gets more and more of the place as the series continues. I mean, I couldn't sort of bear the idea of doing, I don't know, Janet Ivanovich in Delhi with just sort of the same setting over and over and over again. I mean, I really want to be able to describe the place in great detail, and all the color, all the vibrancy of India, and the contrasts, the contradictions, the clash of modern and old. So for me, that does create a slight problem in that I don't, which probably shows, to be honest, but I don't have plots and great twists planned out. I decide, okay, it's going to be about this. I also tend to come across real-life material like the Love Commandos or the Diamond Couriers in Western India, who basically courier pretty much the world's entire supply of diamonds uncut, from Bombay to the cutting and polishing sweatshops in the western state of Gujarat, and they carry them all up their trouser legs or in pots of face cream or whatever. I mean, we're talking billions of dollars of diamonds every year, and DHL, Federal Express, and UPS doesn't touch any of them. I mean, it's a completely it's a great example of how an Indian system can work completely under the radar. And so when I come across something like that, my motivation is to try and find a way to get it into the book, because I think it just tells you so much about how this place works. The problem for me then becomes working out how the damn plot works. and I often sort of write myself into corners and have to figure out how it's all going to fit together.
You also mentioned tradition and the old and the new, tradition and modernity, and Vish-Puri has great kind of diatribes that he occasionally goes on about the modernity of Delhi and of India. Is that something? I mean, I assume that is very much real and happening. His house is being overtaken, it sounds like, by high-rise condominiums. Can you talk a little bit about that modernization of the culture? As you mentioned, it's a very ancient culture, thousands of years old. What is happening as far as that spread in Delhi and the modernization?
Well, I mean, Delhi, when I put it this way, when I came to Delhi in the mid-90s, I came here exactly, actually, almost to the day, 20 years ago. I found a city that was a complete backwater. I mean, the Indian economy was doing incredibly badly. I think the growth rate was 1.5% a year, while the population was growing at an extremely alarming rate. So you had a very, very weak economy, and Delhi was small, really sort of provincial. I mean, the nice thing was there was very, very little traffic because there were very few cars. You could really only buy 2 models of car, 3 maybe, one of which was based on the British Morris, I can't remember now, I think it was the Morris Minor, which dated back to 1952 or something. So, I mean, and Puri still drives one of those cars, but I mean, you hardly see any of them on the road these days. And that's a pretty good indicator of how much Delhi has changed. So it went from a city in 1995 from, I think, something like 5-6 million people, and very sleepy. There were no restaurants. There were no shopping malls. The only sort of social life was basically around, people's homes, families, 5-star hotels if you could really afford them, to go for a drink at a 5-star hotel. Now, I mean, the National Capital Region of India, which includes Delhi and some of the other satellite cities around it, is over 20. It's probably something like 22 million people. And you can't get anywhere in Delhi now in the traffic. It's the pollution levels at the moment are basically the highest in the world. So you've had this absolutely enormous migration into Delhi, and then, as I describe in the books, these satellite cities have grown up around with call centers, enormous apartment blocks, gated communities, spreading out into the farmland, big glass, shiny office blocks for banks and insurance companies, etc. So it's South Delhi, Old Delhi are kind of recognizable. The rest of it just didn't exist 20 years ago. So you've had this huge change, and at the same time, India's starting to open up to the outside world, which it's never ever been a part of, really, even when it was a huge economy in the time before the British. So you have Indians suddenly spreading their wings. They're not natural travelers. Indians have never traveled, really. There was a huge taboo against leaving India because you lost your caste as a caste Hindu if you left Mother India, because you couldn't wash away your sins, essentially, outside, away from the holy rivers. So Indians have never really traveled, and they're starting to do that. And there's huge numbers living in all sorts, every different part of the world. So that's a huge change. So yeah, it's getting in all that is important, I think, to anybody reading about modern India today.
And do you ever see these books as a movie or a television series?
I do. It's a little easier said than done. I've had several how shall we put it, negotiations which seem very promising and positive with different bits of Hollywood for TV and film. None of it has worked so far, but I've just had an offer actually, which we're trying to negotiate at the moment, and it would be for a TV series. So fingers crossed it works. I mean, obviously, I want to be fabulously rich and famous, but at the same, only kidding. At the same time, I think it would just be so great to see. It's so rare actually that you see India on the screen. I mean, unless you happen to be into Bollywood films or even sort of arty Indian cinema. You just hardly ever see it. I think that was one of the reasons why Slumdog Millionaire was so popular. I was actually in New York when it came out. My wife and I went and saw it on the opening night, having absolutely no idea what it was about. We'd only seen it advertised on TV and thought it looked interesting. And it was just such a visually spectacular film, because India is just so extraordinary to look at, and you see it so rarely, unfortunately. I mean, it's tough to film here, but I really hope it works, because I just think it could be so great.
And do you have is there a fifth book coming out?
Actually, Vish Puri himself has written the Delhi Detectives Guidebook, which he just finished, which is his own guide to how to be a detective in India, and it has illustrations, and I'm hoping that's going to come out this year. It's full of all sorts of tips and on how to get up to all sorts of shenanigans. I've been working on something completely different. I've taken a little break in the last 6-7 months. I've been working on a historical novel set in London in the 1880s, which is very, very, very different, and has taken a huge amount of reading and research, and hasn't quite been working up to now, but I think it is now. It's been quite. Historical fiction is much more challenging, because you just start writing, you suddenly realize, hang on, what did the street look like? I've got to find out. Well, rather than just looking around you and saying, here's the detail I need.
Tarquin, thank you so much. Are there any final questions from our audience? We've had several questions come in, and we just thank everybody. I did want to mention Vish Puri has a website. I think it's just vishpuri.com, and you can find out more about, there's a map of Delhi. There is information about tube light, face cream, handbrake, flush, all of the operatives, the family. So if you've enjoyed The Case of the Missing Servant, there are at least 3 more books that you can read in the series. And as I mentioned, The Case of the Deadly Butter Chicken brings in the India-Pakistan relationship. You have The Case of the Love Commandos and The Case of the Man Who Died Laughing. And there's religious issues and marriage issues in these, lots of great social issues and ways to learn about India. I've also created a Pinterest board. The URL is just bit.ly/vishpuri. This has about 10 resources on it, including Tarquin's website, the website I just mentioned, and some lesson plans, country profiles of India, a resource guide on South Asia that Primary Sources created, We also have a human-environment interaction lesson about India, and there's an article about the caste system that's on the Asia Society website. So if you're looking for more resources that connect to the book, this is a great website that you might want to visit. And the URL is there at the top of the page. Tarquin, thank you again. I know it is so late in Delhi, and we really appreciate your time and listening to you talk about your books and your experiences. This has been really great. Thank you so, so much. And for those of you who want to keep in touch with Primary Source and our Global Read series and our global literature and professional development opportunities, you can follow us on Facebook or Twitter and our Pinterest website as well. Thank you all. We will be sending out the recording in a couple of days, and we just appreciate your participation and hope that you've learned a lot about this culture through literature. Tarquin, thank you again.
Thank you.
Hope you have a nice evening.
Yeah, I'm going straight to sleep now. But thank you very much for having me. It was fun to chat.
Yes, thank you so much.